Okay, so this is our Simondon reading group. We're continuing our reading of Imagination and Invention. We are on page 178 of the translation. So we're almost at the end of part 4 of the book. I think we're going to finish that today. So that's the part on invention, the last stage of his cycle of the image. And so the last couple of sessions, we looked at technical invention, so inventing technical objects. And so this is drawing on his work on the mode of existence of technical objects. And a couple of the examples are new ones. They aren't from that work, from that other book. A couple of them are drawn from that book or related to the ones talked about in that book. But I think the core, so a couple of key points here are a technical object is a creation in the sense that it's something that exists independent of the activity of the being that creates it. So when you, and this is how we contrast human technical objects, human created technical objects with technical objects of other animals. So we know that lots of animals use tools of various kinds. Like an example that I talked about a few times is chimpanzees that will stick a branch into a twig into a tree and pull out the ants that live inside the tree and eat them. But this twig is then discarded, or it only has any sort of relevance to this task of getting ants to eat as the chimpanzee is using it, and then it's just sort of thrown away and then just becomes a regular twig again. Whereas human tool use or tool creation often involves producing something that can be reused, can be improved upon, that can be passed down through generations, etc. So you can think of something like even a simple like hand axe. So taking a stone and napping it so that it has a sharp edge that you can use to chop things. Even something like this is something that you're not going to just discard after using it once. You invest time in making this tool that has properties that you want to be able to use to perform certain tasks. So then you're going to keep this tool, and then potentially as it gets dull from use, you will resharpen it or re-nap it so it has a sharp edge again. You might pass it down to your children or other people to use. You might trade it for something else, etc., etc. So this tool, even though it's the product of a living being, namely a human being, it has sort of reality independent of that person. It can be used by another person. And then also, in addition to just being sort of that one individual tool being used by another person, it can serve as the basis for another tool. So you can use this tool to produce, say, something out of wood, some wooden tool that is used for another purpose. So you can use one tool to make another tool, and then you can also you can use a tool as a basis for a more developed tool. So a stone axe might serve as an inspiration for a metal axe of some kind. So you've developed something that is an improvement on the original tool, using a different method of production or a different set of materials or whatever. And so for Simondon, these are all sort of characteristics that distinguish human tool use from other animals' tool use. So it's, I think, open to question how much that is still accurate in terms of our knowledge of animal tool use today. So to some extent, this distinction is less clear than it was in Simondon's time. But yeah, so this notion of an independent existence of the technical object is sort of the key idea for Simondon. And this is what he's going to develop further in his notion of how an invention is a kind of what he calls concretization in the other book on the mode of existence of technical objects. So a technical object becomes more concrete the more its multiple different components start to be sort of organically connected to each other, in the sense that each component doesn't just contribute one function to the operation of the whole component, the whole technical object. Instead, each part or each component is plurifunctional, so it contributes multiple different functions to the functioning of the whole. And in particular, in a less concrete or a more abstract technical object, you have the one function of a component, and then everything else, all the other physical properties of that component, is just sort of noise, or it detracts from the functioning of the component. So you think of like electronic components that have some sort of background noise. Like if you turn on a radio, there's a certain hum or hiss kind of noise that you can hear. Or like in a mechanical device, there's friction between gears or other components. So these are sort of undesired effects of the components that are not part of the functioning of the whole device. And then in a more concrete technical object, you have more and more of those sort of side effects get incorporated into the functioning of the whole, so that the device no longer, or to a lesser extent, destroys itself through its own functioning. So a less concrete mechanical device, for example, that has a lot of friction will wear down quickly, and you'll have to replace the parts relatively often. And then a more concrete mechanical device will have less friction, or will use the friction for some sort of useful purpose in the functioning of the device. And so the functioning of the device is less self-destructive, and that means that the entity, this technical object as a whole, is more sort of independent and self-subsistent. So it has more independent reality than the abstract technical object before. And so this is, I think, Simondon's sort of key concept in studying the evolution of technical objects. And so, yeah, it's in this sense that the creation of a technical object is an actual creation or invention. It's something new that appears because, as he points out in the passage, or in the last section that we just read, the last couple of weeks, when you try to solve a problem through a technical device, like when you try to, your device is, you want to do X with the device and it doesn't do X, and then you try to improve your device so that it does X. It's almost never the case that you can just sort of find a solution that sort of perfectly maps onto this desired goal, and that's it. Generally, you have to include a lot more in your solution than just the particular goal that you're aiming towards, and it's this sort of surplus that constitutes this intrinsic reality of a technical object. So you, by trying to solve a particular problem, like getting more output from your steam engine, for example, to some extent you can, like, for a certain amount of time, you can just make your steam engine bigger and bigger and get more output. But then the steam engine starts becoming too heavy or too bulky to use on a train, for example. And then you have to actually redesign the steam engine, as he describes in one of the examples in this book. You have to redesign the steam engine using a new schema of operation, so that it's and this new steam engine doesn't just solve the problem of getting more output without taking up more space or without extra weight, but it also has a completely different mode of functioning, which is less self-destructive, and so on. So by trying to achieve a certain limited goal of, more output of your steam engine or whatever, you end up having to solve a much bigger problem and creating a whole new schema of operation of a technical object. And so you're sort of incorporating this sort of effect, this physical process that previously was not part of the functioning of the technical object into that technical object. So you're sort of adding more reality to the technical object, and so it's in that sense that it's a creation or an invention. It's not just a sort of incremental improvement to an existing technical object. Okay, so yeah, the last section in this part is passing from the creation of technical objects to the creation of art objects. Or aesthetic objects, sorry, is the term that he uses. So yeah, let's stop here, and then we can start the reading if one of you would like to read.
I can read. Subsection 2, other categories of created objects, in particular the aesthetic object. The existence of several layers around an object responding to mental images is not the exclusive characteristic of the technical object. It is also found in the domain of the sacred, linked to the profane by different zones that mediate and protect it, but also hide to some extent what is essentially sacred, what constitutes the source and resistant nexus of sacredness. See the study on technicité et sacralité, technicity and sacredness, part of a course of social psychology delivered at the Faculté des Lettres of Lyon and published in the Bulletin de l'École pratique de psychologie de l'Université de Lyon. It is likely that the sacred object cannot be multiplied like the invented technical object. Its sacredness is propagated to some extent through contact and intention, or through the fragmentation of a unique primitive object. Finally, the ritualization of sacrifice constitutes a spatial and temporal reticulation that universalizes sacredness and creates an interaction between nature and the sacred that is formally comparable to that which characterizes the development of technical objects. Perhaps even the dialectical process described above may also occur through the dissemination of the sacred through paths analogous to those of technicity. This would allow us to posit that, in part, sacredness corresponds to a creative activity concretizing the genesis of images with an incorporation of effects contained neither in the finalizing intention nor in the process of project of ritualizing, and with a similar opacity of univocity with respect to conceptual analysis. The category of aesthetic objects lends itself more easily to observation, or perhaps even analysis in our societies. The mode of existence of these objects reveals a plurality of more or less deep layers, that is, more or less proximal to the result of invention, with a mode to the result of invention with mode of a superficial type, and styles which imply a dissemination across a group of amateurs who are partially initiated and sometimes capable of reproducing, imitating, and organizing a limited world according to the norms drawn from the created object, such as the way furniture is arranged to showcase artworks constituting their milieu. Maybe I'll do one more paragraph. However, the topological analogies between the various layers of objects do not constitute the essential part of the effects of the invention activity as the endpoint term of the genesis of images. The essential part of invention resides in the effective amplification by the recruitment of initially unexpected realities and the integration of these realities with new powers surpassing the origin into a formalized system. The development of this formalization, which is a consequence of the cumulative character of inventions, entails the incorporation of realities that were at first non-human into a world that has meaning for humans. Indeed, this is also what occurs in the evolution of the different arts, to the extent that they produce works independent of their creators and broader than the conditions of their invention. A work is less broad than the conditions of its invention when it is directed by a predetermined and predetermining finality, which gives itself the possibility of choosing an object to alter by detaching it from the conditions of its natural existence, hence selecting a landscape, a house, or trees in order to paint them based on the already picturesque character of these objects is to extract through selection an already constituted aspect, remaining at a superficial layer of reality, altered according to the time and place. Such activity, rather than amplifying, captures and reduces. It exhausts its subject the way one exhausts a source of natural energy, since it takes from the world homogeneous realities. The obsolescence of such forms of art is comparable to that of technical objects in which the superficial layer predominates, making them accessories of a defined attitude. The decorative object and the hit song belong to this superficial category. For a current example, we may take that of opticalized objects unconnected to meaning, use, or nature, from clothing to jewelry and automobiles to furniture. What these cases lack with respect to invention is the discovery of compatibility. The opticalized motif is produced separately and imposed in a violent way onto forms whose genesis did not anticipate such an encounter. There's now an opticalized commercial adhesive tape that can be taped on any object in whatever manner. Art operates here through the addition of a pre-established superficial film on things, whose essential character is not modified. It is not creative because it is not demiurgic. It is only a masking and additive form of art without an activity of incorporation. Of course, optical motifs may have a meaning and be integrated when they underscore the remarkable points of an object, such as a rocket a target, a test pattern, a buoy, or a milepost. But in such cases, these motifs are precisely those of a shape, size, and color adapted to the object and its situation. Such superficial use is not recent. In other periods, there are profusions of ribbons or flowers on clothing, furniture, etc. So Simondon is comparing landscape art, or maybe more broadly, representational art in general, or representational painting, with the most superficial layer of the technical object, which is furthest away from the essence of the object as the actual invention, or the essential disparation that's resolved in the engine, for instance, the car. There's this interesting idea that a painting of a landscape is sort of exhausted by its concept. There's kind of nothing in it that goes beyond the painting of the sort of the mimesis of the landscape itself, which probably isn't true of all landscape paintings, but seems like a fair assessment of a lot of. There's a lot of pretty boring landscape painting out there. So,
yeah, I think he's probably not rejecting representational art as a whole here. I think he's I think if you asked him about Michelangelo or like the Dutch masters or something like that, like he would say that these are real artworks that have a value beyond just their resemblance to the models that they purport to show. I think what he's getting at is this. There's a sort of doubling effect of certain types of art or certain artworks where it only serves as a copy of what it depicts, which is already selected to be something picturesque is the term that he uses here, and that we use to describe certain landscapes. For example, like if your landscape is already a picture, the one that you're looking at is already a picture, and then you just sort of copy it into a picture that you can put up on your wall in your living room or whatever, and you haven't actually captured any aspect of the landscape beyond the fact that it looks like a picture, and then you just turned what looked like a picture into an actual picture. So you haven't really added any reality or invented anything new by virtue of creating that landscape. He goes on in the next bit that we'll see in the next section to talk about the Impressionists, or he mentions the Impressionists, and so here we have, of course, there's a lot of Impressionists or sort of post-Impressionists like Cézanne, for example, who paint landscapes, but they do so not just like here's a accurate representation of what this landscape looked like on this particular occasion, but instead they're trying to capture something about like the way that light interacts with the color of objects, the way that shapes stand out in a particular lighting or whatever. So capturing some aspect of the scene that you might not notice. Only an artist who has this capacity of creativity and invention notices this aspect of the landscape and captures it in the artwork. And it's that capturing of some unnoticed aspect of the landscape, or making this unnoticed aspect stand out, that is a kind of invention. And even like a photographer, for example, can it's maybe harder to do than with a painting, but like a photographer can also capture some element of the landscape or make some element stand out that you wouldn't notice otherwise. Through effects of lighting, or the way that the aperture is set up and things like that. I don't know exactly how they do these things, but there's like a certain skill that is involved in being able to capture these aspects of reality that you otherwise would not see, making visible something that was not visible or that was sort of passed over previously. One point of translation that I think as you were reading, you sort of noticed that this was kind of weird in the translation. I mentioned in the chat here. So on page 178, at the bottom of the page, that first sentence, it has this phrase "with mode," which is weird. It should actually say "with fashions." So this is just a translation error. So le mode is mode or manner or something like that, and la mode is fashion.
Mm-hmm.
And here Simondon means lamud. So he's talking about how in the case of aesthetic objects, there is this sort of superficial layer of fashions. A certain school of art becomes trendy. People want to have their artworks displayed in their living room or wherever. They want to buy objects that are inspired by their style of art, etc. And then maybe 10 years later, that style of art is passé, and no one wants to show their stuff anymore. So this is like a certain superficial use of the aesthetic object. It only serves to it's an expressive or semiotic use of the artwork, in the same way that the the aluminum dashboard on the car was purely semiotic. So the aluminum dashboard on the car just is a signifier of sort of technical sophistication and being up to date and so on. And didn't have any real impact on the actual functioning of the car. And likewise, showing off that you have the latest, trendy school of art displayed in your apartment is just a way of sort of signifying how you're, cool and with it and so on, as opposed to, appreciating this artwork as an aesthetic invention, as, making visible something about reality that was not visible before. And so on. So that's what he's getting at in that passage. And I think, the first paragraph is also a bit difficult. I think this he's sort of alluding here to some of the developments in the third part of On the Mode of Existence of Technical Objects, where he talks about the relationship between different modes of existence, different modes of human existence, or different ways of being in the world. And especially here when he uses this term reticulation, this is a term that in that book is used of the magical mode of existence, so the sort of primary mode of existence before any kind of split between subject and object or figure and ground. And so this term reticulation, in that context, what he's referring to is the way that in this magical mode of existence, the world is sort of structured in this network of key points. So like the peak of a mountain or the center of a forest or whatever. These are points where all the sort of magical power of a region is concentrated in these points. And then likewise, you have key points in time. So the new moon or the full moon or some lunar cycle. And then you have the new year or Halloween or whatever other sort of moments in the year that have this specific magical power. They sort of concentrate the moments, concentrate the magical power of the rest of the year into one moment. And so I think when he's talking about the sacred here, he is sort of alluding to this development, though I think he's probably not identifying the sacred with the magical. Those are probably different categories, but in that book, he also talks about, like in the later developments, he talks about how the aesthetic arises out of, this sort of splitting process, splitting out of the original magical mode of being. I think it's also in Individuation where he talks about the relationship between the sacred and the art object. And the art object is sort of, in our society, is a kind of remnant of the sacred in a lot of ways. So like you can think of, medieval art, for example, was in Europe, specifically medieval art was almost exclusively religious art. It was used to decorate churches and manuscripts of the Bible and so on. And then in the Renaissance, you have, again, lots of religious painting, but also, portraits and so on. But again, the development of art in like, say, from the Renaissance onwards is a sort of separation of art as an independent sphere from religion. So in some ways, our sort of attitude to the artwork is descended from a religious or a sacred understanding of the object. So like you think of an artwork is always presented in a gallery or in some sort of setting that is like appropriate in some way to that artwork. You wouldn't hang a beautiful painting in your bathroom, for example. you want to sort of display your respect for this object by the way that you hang it, by the way that you approach it and observe it, and so on. And you can think also of like the way that there's a whole specialized industry of like moving paintings, for example, of like preserving the temperature and humidity and so on, so that they aren't damaged in travel. It's a pretty elaborate process, especially with older paintings, because of the fragility or the way that they can be damaged by any sort of sudden changes of environmental conditions. So yeah, we have this sort of elaborate set of behaviors, or you could call them rituals even, of like how we interact with these art objects that is meant to sort of preserve their specialness in a way that's similar to the way that sacred objects, relics of saints or whatever, are handled in religious contexts. So I think that's what he's getting at in that first bit. But again, like a sacred object is different in certain ways from an art object, in the sense that an art object is reproducible. Either you can make prints of a painting, for example, but also the master or the painter can make many paintings, whereas a sacred object is something that happens through one sort of event, the death of a saint, for example. It's not repeatable in the way that an art object is.
Yes, that's interesting about the transition from the sacred object to the art object. I was reading recently about this. There's a German art critic named Hans Belting who argued that in a meaningful sense there wasn't art in the way in which we think of it prior to the Renaissance. Most medieval artists who did religious painting or created religious artworks were more or less anonymous. Like if you go to a museum, the medieval Western art section, you'll often see the name of the artist will be like the master of the such and such tapestry, or such and such a painting, because the individuality of the artist wasn't important, which changed in the Renaissance. And so there's this art sort of arises out of the sacred, at least in the history of Western art, and then obviously changes pretty dramatically in the 20th century. But one other thing I wanted to mention is, I think I talked about this before we started recording in the last session, but I was reading some Clement Greenberg recently. He was like a major art critic of abstract mid-century painting, and he argues that abstract painting sort of requires something of the viewer in the way that straightforwardly representational painting does not, in a way that reminded me of Simondon's discussion of these different layers of the technical object, and how the mass-produced camera can do for the user what the professional photographer has to know and bring to the process of creating a photograph. In a similar way, Greenberg argues that a Picasso painting just doesn't do that for the viewer. You have to kind of do that for yourself when you see the painting. It's an interesting resonance between what Greenberg says about realist painting and what Simondon says about landscape paintings and paintings of houses here.
Yeah, that's interesting. Also, because I know that some early Renaissance painters like Dürer and Leonardo da Vinci, for example, they understood their work as a kind of quasi-scientific process. Like Da Vinci did, anatomical dissections, and he, draws like diagrams of human muscles and skeleton and so on, as like preparatory work for painting. And painting is therefore understood as a sort of technique of representation that your goal is to sort of capture the perspectival projection of a scene, but of course in doing that they are doing something much more creative than just sort of copying what they see. like they're actually inventing perspective as they're doing this process, and so they're creating something that never existed before in Western art, or not exactly in that form. So yeah, I guess so. There's a difference between like inventing perspective, being the people that develop this technique of depiction, and then 200 years later or 300 years later, using a well-developed technique of perspective to paint a pretty landscape or something like that. So these are like different types of activity. And yeah, the bit about the anonymity of like medieval painters is also interesting. I think we can probably connect this with the notion of an individuation of an art object. Like it's only when an art object becomes something individuated in its own right, it becomes an object that you appreciate for its aesthetic value, as opposed to the way that it illustrates a particular religious message or something along those lines. It's only when that happens that the individuality of the artist starts to become important. So medieval artists are essentially just skilled craftsmen who are capable of producing beautiful illustrations of religious messages, and elevating the souls of the parishioners and so on. But they're not like understood as creating something individuated that would be valued independent of its role in conveying a message and producing a certain spiritual experience and so on. It's only in the Renaissance where you end up with something like an aesthetic object appreciated for its own value as aesthetic object, even though many of them are religious in nature, in terms of the subject matter they depict. But at the same time, they're appreciated as aesthetic objects, independent of whatever religious message they might be conveying. So yeah, the sort of transformation of the relationship between aesthetic production and individuality that happens around the Renaissance. Angus, could you expand on this bit about sponges? I don't think I see the connection exactly.
Oh yeah, just what you were saying about the medieval artist as kind of elevating as a craftsman for the benefit of the community. That part in Volume 1 where he talks about individuation, these limit cases of colonial life versus, the point at which being goes from being part of a colony or an organ of a colony to being an individual. And I remember he says that in some cases there's like the real test for individuation is whether there's this informational autonomy rather than a kind of physical separation of from the colony. But I guess what I was thinking is that you could see this more colonial life form as corresponding to the medieval communal approach to art, and then in the Renaissance you have, I guess, a kind of individuation of the artist, which someone like Burckhardt would probably try to associate with like Renaissance politics, although I understand that he's not. Contemporary scholars of Renaissance history are pretty critical of Burckhardt, but I don't know. I think you could maybe force this parallel between the individuation of like jellyfish and sponges and the individuation of Renaissance artists.
Yeah, that's interesting. I think also maybe in connection with this is the way that art production was often, in medieval and into the Renaissance and early modern times, was often, done by a workshop. So someone like Michelangelo or Rembrandt or whoever would be like the master of a workshop, and they might do the face on a painting and the hands or whatever, and then leave all the background stuff to one of their apprentices. And so like they would sort of maximize the amount of paintings they could produce for their clients, by dividing up the task and leaving the boring and easy parts to the apprentices. And so even after this like start of the individuation in the Renaissance, the actual production process of the painting is still communal in the sense, or at least a sort of workshop process, as opposed to one sort of genius as like later in sort of romantic versions of the art individuation relationship have it. So yeah, you have a whole workshop is involved in the creation of the art object as opposed to this one person. So I think yeah, you have this emergence of the individuality of the artwork and the individuality of the artist that sort of goes with it. But it's a sort of gradual process that takes probably a few hundred years to actually sort of end up with the romantic idea of the artist as a lone genius who sort of captures something that no one else has ever thought of before. And yeah, so I think in individuation, there's this notion, like when he talks about those sponges, he talks, or in similar corals and these types of organisms that have this sort of colony form. One interesting bit about the relation with individuation is how the sort of individual form of this organism is often associated with reproduction. So like you have a colony of sponges that lives for a certain amount of time, and then under certain conditions, like I don't know, environmental stress or whatever, they will separate out, or one of them will separate out and form a free swimming individual organism that swims around until it finds a good location and then settles again and starts to bud and produce a new colony. So yeah, there's a connection between reproduction and individuation that he talks about in that part in the individuation book, and maybe we can also connect this with the way that here in this book he describes the art object as more reproducible than a sacred object. So yeah, something about how an art object can be reproduced either through mechanical means like a print, or you can make multiple copies of a painting. Some artists have done that, or some artists also make series of paintings, like multiple variations on the same sort of arrangement, or like different studies for the same painting or something like that. So this sort of reproducibility of the artwork maybe is connected to the way that it becomes more individuated in the Renaissance as well. But yeah, I'm not sure exactly how to articulate that connection. Okay, so let's go on to the next bit. I can read this passage. The middle layer in the production of created aesthetic objects is that in which activity is neither a random coding nor an amplifying invention, but an elaboration that stays in place, as it were, without an increase or decrease of limits, without gain or loss, remaining within a closed and chosen universe of connoisseurs who form a coterie. A way of acting and a set of processes are preserved and transmitted through time, with neither learning nor forgetting. This modality represents, as in the case of technical objects, the attitude and tendency of those who, without being creators, make use of the arts as accessories to their main activity, as a hobby practiced with taste and distinction, but in a relatively marginal way with respect to a central activity, such as the way a journalist uses photography. A journalist's requirement for a photograph is that it be technically skillful and a satisfactory accessory to his investigation or discovery, which is that of a reality essentially expressed in the written text. Similarly, a dedicated amateur expects an art object to be satisfying and skillful within a marginal and limited universe that produces its own norms. For this reason, the amateur tends to be conservative, that is, inclined to appreciate techniques that are relatively old. Today in France, according to Monsieur Ignace Meyerson, a widespread cultivated public appreciates impressionist paintings. According to the schema of dialectical reversal, the activity of creators in the arts should be archaizing, or at least it could appear as primitive. And this is true. The music of Xenakis, for instance, Terra Tector, presented in April 1966 by the ORTF, is disconcerting to professional musicians. A violinist from the orchestra showed with perceptible sadness the objects given to him as instruments. A whistle, another gourd-shaped object, the kind of things usually reserved for the drummer of the ensemble. The violinist resigned himself to using this object with the imposed rhythm, but could not accept calling it music. Yet despite the nobility of this attitude of refusal within elevated norms, Xenakis' piece is nonetheless a work that integrates very primitive sounds and noises produced by easy-to-build instruments, which have existed for thousands of years. You might say they are raw sounds just as much as they are musical sounds. This work integrates the effect of a wild sonic matter and incorporates it into such a complete formalization that it determines, during the performance, displacements of the localizable source of sound across the performers as if they were part of the aesthetic perception. In the domain of architecture, we have referred to the power of discovery of Le Corbusier's thought and the simultaneously futuristic and raw character of his use of materials, whether rough or industrial, without the simulation. What comes out of industrial work is, like concrete, raw in a certain way. The marks of constructive human activity, such as the traces left by wooden molds, may be retained for the final perceptual mode of the building. The final work integrates the phases of its fabrication in perceptual modalities, which thus remain perpetually present in the constituted work, as though it were in the very process of being made. Aesthetic amplification recruits present effects, such as the imprint of wood boards in the concrete that fills the voids, making them into a compatible system for the whole duration of the work. The work provides a futural dimension to the ephemeral gesture. It temporally universalizes it. It also bestows a dimension of spatial universality to a local reality by inserting it into a whole in which it plays a full and prominent role as the single representative of its species in this place. Smooth pebbles from the closest river were incorporated into the facade of the cont'd convent, giving the building the power to display native reality in its perceptible materiality. This materiality, formalized by invention, the only one in the world of its kind within the relation of compatibility it maintains with the universe of other artworks, confers a spatial universality to what constitutes it, as if it were meant to manifest the local character of things insofar as they are the unique particular aspect of a multiform universe, like a word or expression within a language that can be indefinitely enriched. The archaism of raw reality and the local character of the perceptual display of matter, these are the sources of the effects that art, in the strong sense, as inventor of created objects, recruits and displays by dilating them towards the time to come and the universality of a space. Right, so here he's contrasting, I guess, two different modes of temporality of aesthetic objects, which might, at the first glance, seem similar, or you might have a hard time distinguishing them. So the sort of amateur or the hobbyist is conservative in the sense that they sort of hold on to art forms from the recent past as like sort of signifiers, or not so much signifiers as in the purely superficial level, but they hold on to art forms from the past as expressing as having a certain beauty or aesthetic value in that they produce pleasure. So, like in his example, he's writing in the '60s. Of course, he points to the way that people are sort of still appreciating the Impressionists, and maybe producing their own paintings in Impressionist style. And of course, the Impressionists were from the late 19th, early 20th century. So people are sort of holding on to a style from 80, 60, whatever years in the past at the time that he's writing. And often this is accompanied by a sort of rejection of everything that comes after your sort of preferred time period. You say like the Impressionists were kind of the peak of artistic creation, and everything after the Impressionists was a sort of decline or degeneration or whatever, or it's not really art or something along those lines. And then in contrast to this attitude of conservatism, there's what he calls archaism, and so this is it also sort of looks into the past, but not like a recent past, but a very distant past, or even possibly a mythical past. So the example that he chooses here is taking these sort of instruments that a gourd or whatever that would presumably have been around for thousands of years, and putting them to use in a new artistic context. So of course, like using a gourd in an orchestra and using it as a part of a musical composition in this context is very different than some Sumerian shepherd or whatever in 3000 BC using a gourd to produce music. So you're sort of reaching back into the distant past, but you're doing so in a way that allows you to produce something very new, as opposed to just sort of holding on to something in the recent past to sort of resist any novelty. And again, like the other example, this is one of his sort of favorite examples, is Le Corbusier's artwork or architecture, where the use of like modern construction techniques like pre-stressed concrete and things like that allows for this sort of rawness, the sort of materiality of the construction materials is part of the design of the artwork of the building. It's not sort of hidden away or covered over with paint or tiles or whatever. it's this sort of bare concrete is part of the aesthetic experience of this building. So in this sense, you're sort of connecting the what's most recent with what is ancient, like skipping over the recent past, as opposed to the hobbyist who like sort of holds on to the recent past to avoid having to deal with the modern or the contemporary. So these are sort of two different modes of relating the aesthetic object to the past.
I like the way that he describes the aesthetic object as this kind of determination of appearance that preserves an appearance and gives it a futural dimension, which is presumably virtually universal in the same way that the seed germ for crystallization is. I don't know if I don't think he's saying that all art needs to be archaizing in this way. The example that he gives to Xenakis is kind of specific and not representative of a lot of, music being made in the 1960s. And I can think of a lot of artworks that don't have this, really deeply archaic aspect to it. But maybe, as you suggested, he's just saying that this is one way of having a beneficial relationship to the past.
Yeah, I think maybe these are sort of more direct examples of archaizing that that are not typical of other artworks. Not everyone writing music in the '60s was giving their violinists gourds to play on. But I think there's a sense in which creation of a new artwork always does involve some sort of capture of some element of the past and sort of revitalization of this element of the past, in the sense that there are these sort of raw elements of reality that can be something like color, like sort of bare color, for example, like the Impressionists, for example. The way when Simondon was talking about them in the 1960s, he's talking about them as like a sort of conservative model that these hobbyists are pointing to. But of course, when they were first painting, they were sort of the avant-garde, and they were denied. They weren't allowed to exhibit in like the establishment salons and things like that. And what they were doing is sort of capturing the play of light and the impressions of color that you experience, as opposed to depicting objects. And so these sort of impressions of color are in some sense archaic. Like every human being, throughout the evolution of human beings, and even prior to modern human beings, other primates, for example, had color vision and presumably had sort of experience of color. But that experience of color was always subordinated to the perception of objects. That you only paid attention to color insofar as it was relevant for identifying, what kind of object am I dealing with. And so the Impressionists sort of go back into this very sort of raw aspect of experience that sort of prior to the formation of objects in perception. And they capture this and make it visible in a way that it wasn't before. So yeah, I think there's like an aspect of, maybe archaic is not exactly the right term, but it's this raw aspect of reality that you're sort of uncovering something that is normally hidden in our experience of the world or our encounter with objects. You're sort of removing like the veneer of things and letting us sort of experience their rawness in a way that wasn't experienceable before. So I think that's like what he means here by archaizing. It's not necessarily a sort of temporal. It can be a reference or a connection to the distant past, like in the case of Xenakis that he talks about. But it can also be just this sort of uncovering an aspect of reality that was there all along, or that we sort of, after the artwork makes it visible, it becomes something that was there all along, if that makes sense. It sort of retroactively gets put back into the past.
Yeah, we were kind of talking in the comments about the Ezra Pound thing, make it new. Like, you can take the past of the history of the art form and do something radically new with it. I think probably the best avant-garde art tends to engage with a tradition in some way, and maybe that's what Simondon is advocating for.
Yeah, it's this way, like, I think we've talked about this before about how, like, if you just create something that has no connection to the past, if it's completely new, then in some sense it's not really creating anything. It's just sort of randomness. And there have been artists who have sort of incorporated randomness into their productions in some way. But usually that's like in sort of explicit contrast to a more controlled way of producing art. But yeah, so like having some sort of contrast with something that came before, where you're explicitly situating, or maybe not explicitly, but sometimes implicitly, you're situating your production in relation to what came before, and it could be either like the previous generation, or it could be ancient Greek art, whatever. Like in the Renaissance, people sort of look to ancient Greek art as a model and use it to produce something new that was very different from the art that they were familiar with from like medieval artists. So yeah, there's this sort of making the past, making some aspect of the past visible that that was not visible, uh, in the past itself. So capturing this rawness that maybe was hidden or covered over by the artwork beforehand. So yeah, I know, Angus, you said you have to go. Maybe this is a good place to stop since we're right at the top of a page, and I think we're also at a bit of a change of subject in the discussion. So yeah, we can stop here if that works for you.
That sounds good to me. Maybe we can do a full 2 hours next time.
Yeah, we'll see. I think we'll try to meet an hour earlier, if that works for everyone, and then we may be able to finish the rest of the book, depending on how. Again, there's no rush. We don't have to sort of try to finish it, but like depending on how much we spend on discussion of each section. So yeah,
that sounds good to me.
Okay, so thanks everyone. I'll put a note in or I'll create the event an hour earlier for next week, and hopefully everyone can make it that time. Yeah, so see you next week.